The letter hit the floor of Ruby Harper's kitchen like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples of it nearly brought her to her knees. She had read it 3 times already. Standing in the doorway of the modest clapboard house she had rented on the edge of Redemption, Texas, and each reading made the words burn hotter than the last. The handwriting was unmistakably that of Gerald Alcott, the man she had traveled 400 miles to marry, the man whose advertisement in the St. Louis Courier had promised her a home, a future, and a partner in the building of something real. The words were precise, almost clinical, the way a man writes when he has rehearsed his cruelty until it no longer costs him anything. "Miss Harper," it began, not even the warmth of her given name. "I regret to inform you that the arrangement we discussed has become impossible. I have decided to marry Miss Cordelia Webb of Austin. Her family brings considerable land holdings to the union, and I trust you understand the practical necessities of ranching life. The house on Pell Creek was part of what I intended to offer you. I no longer intend to offer it. You will need to vacate by the end of the month. I am sorry for any inconvenience this causes you." Inconvenience. Ruby pressed the letter against her chest and looked out through the dusty window at the flat sweep of Texas land beyond. She had sold her sewing business in St. Louis. She had said goodbye to the 2 friends she had left in the world. She had packed everything she owned into a single trunk and ridden the train, and then the stagecoach with her heart beating hopeful the whole way. She had been 24 years old and brave enough, she had thought, for anything. Now it was May of 1882, the land outside shimmered with heat, and she had exactly $43, a trunk of clothes, a set of sewing needles, and no plan whatsoever. She did not cry. She had discovered long ago that crying required a certain kind of softness that she could not afford, and she had grown up in a world that ground softness into dust. Her mother had died when Ruby was 9, her father when she was 16, and she had spent the years between working in her aunt's dress shop in Missouri until the aunt sold the shop and moved to her sister's in Kentucky and told Ruby with a kind of cheerful indifference that she was on her own. She was always on her own. She folded the letter carefully, tucked it into the pocket of her blue calico dress, and stood up straight. She had work to do. She had to figure out, in a town where she knew no one, how to survive. It was Mrs. Dolan at the boarding house who told her about the ranchers. Mrs. Dolan was a wide-hipped Irish woman with a voice like a church bell, and a gift for knowing everyone's business within a 10-mile radius. She had let Ruby stay in the boarding house for $2 a week, which was nearly all Ruby could afford, and she seemed to feel a kind of proprietorial affection for Ruby, the way women sometimes do when they recognize a certain kind of quiet stubbornness in someone younger. "Every rancher in this valley has been looking for a housekeeper since old Bessie Greer passed," Mrs. Dolan said over supper on Ruby's second evening in Redemption. "6 of them at least. They all came through here last winter making speeches about what good situations they could offer a capable woman." Ruby looked up from her salt pork. "Housekeeper. Some call it that." Mrs. Dolan smiled into her coffee cup. "Some mean it exactly as they say. Some mean something more eventual. You're a sensible girl. You'd know the difference." Ruby thought about that for a long moment. "Who made the most promises?" Mrs. Dolan laughed, a big, rolling laugh that shook her shoulders. "Oh, Lord. You'd need a week to count them all. Harlan Briggs promised a private room, a horse of your own, Sunday afternoons free, and a salary that would make a banker blush. Said he'd build a whole separate cottage for his housekeeper within the year. And did he? He did not. What about the others?" Mrs. Dolan ticked them off on her fingers. Cole Prescott had promised a garden and a milk cow and had delivered neither. Tom Waverly had promised weekends in town and a new stove and had reneged on both inside of a month. The Beaumont brothers had jointly promised a schoolroom for any children in the household, and the schoolroom never materialized. Rafe Dunmore had promised a woman named Patricia Wills that she could bring her elderly mother to live in the house, then changed his mind when the mother actually arrived. "All big men," Mrs. Dolan said. "All big voices, All the same kind of promise, which is to say the kind that vanishes when the sun gets hot. Ruby was quiet for a moment. You said 6 ranchers. I did. You've named 5. Mrs. Dolan set down her coffee cup and looked at Ruby with something new in her eyes. The 6th one doesn't come into town much. Quiet man. Lionel Trask. Runs a cattle operation about 8 miles northeast near the Callaway Fork. He didn't come in making speeches. She paused. But he sent a letter to the post office in October, addressed to any woman seeking honest domestic work. 3 sentences. Said he needed a housekeeper, said the pay was $12 a month, said the work was hard and the house was plain but both were decent. That's all. That's all. I know because Martha at the post office showed it to me. Mrs. Dolan tilted her head. He's a man of very few words, Lionel Trask, but I will tell you this, and you can take it or leave it. In 4 years since he came to redemption, I have watched every man in this valley promise something and then find a reason not to deliver it. Trask promised old Pete Callaway, who used to work his land, that he'd keep Pete's widow supplied with firewood through her first winter alone. That's a small thing, not the kind of promise a man announces. Nobody was watching, and every 2 weeks, right through January and February, Trask drove a load of wood to that widow's cabin. Ruby listened to all of this very carefully. Nobody was watching, she repeated slowly. Nobody was watching, Mrs. Dolan agreed. The next morning, Ruby Harper asked to borrow a horse and rode 8 miles northeast to find out what kind of man kept his promises when no one was looking. The Callaway Fork was easy enough to find. The road northeast out of Redemption ran straight as a needle through scrubland and pale grass, and when it bent east around a low mesa, she could see the fork of the creek glinting silver through the cottonwoods. The ranch came into view gradually, which she would later think was appropriate for a man like Lionel Trask. It did not announce itself. There was no grand gate, no painted sign. Just a long fence of cedar posts and good wire, a yard that was swept clean, a barn that was large and well-maintained, and a house that was exactly what Mrs. Dolan had said. Plain but decent. 2 dogs came out to meet her, big dusty animals that wagged their tails and sniffed at the horse with friendly curiosity. A hired hand she didn't know came out of the barn, a young man of perhaps 20 with a sun-darkened face and a startled expression. I'm looking for Mr. Trask, Ruby said, keeping her voice steady. I've come about the position he advertised. The housekeeper position. The young man scratched the back of his neck. He hired a woman for that last fall, Mrs. Enders. She went back east in February when her son took sick. Ruby's heart dropped a full inch. I see. But you could ask him. He nodded toward the back of the property. He's working the south pasture fence. Follow that path and you'll find him. She found Lionel Trask half a mile down that path, crouched beside a section of downed fence, working with a pair of pliers and a length of wire with the focused calm of a man who was fully comfortable with silence. He was perhaps 30 years old, perhaps 32, not especially tall but built with a lean and careful solidity, like a structure that had been properly engineered rather than thrown up in a hurry. His hair was dark beneath his hat, his skin was weathered to a warm brown, and his hands were the hands of someone who worked with them every single day. He heard the horse and looked up without alarm, without the elaborate casualness some men affect when they want to seem unimpressed. He just looked up, clear-eyed and attentive, the way an animal in a field will track movement without deciding yet whether it's a threat. Mr. Trask, Ruby said, my name is Ruby Harper. I came from St. Louis to marry Gerald Alcott and he has reconsidered the arrangement. I have $43, a trunk of clothing, and a considerable amount of stubbornness. Mrs. Dolan at the boarding house told me you once advertised for a housekeeper. I understand the position may be filled. I am asking anyway because I have nowhere else productive to direct my morning. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he set the pliers down on top of the fence post. Mrs. Enders left in February, he said. His voice was low and unhurried, not the booming confidence of men who wanted to fill a room. I've been managing without. The position is open if you want it. $12 a month, your own room, meals included. The work is cooking, cleaning, laundry, keeping track of the household supplies. Sundays are your own afternoon. What promises are attached to the position? Ruby asked, because she had learned something the night before. Trask's expression did not change exactly, but something in it shifted, like a door opening a single inch. None that I'm not certain I can keep, he said. She hired on that morning. The house on the Callaway Fork had 4 rooms. A large main room that served as kitchen and parlor combined, 2 small bedrooms at the back, and a lean-to off the kitchen that Trask used for storage. The room Ruby was given was the one on the right, which had a window that faced east and caught the morning light. There was a narrow iron bed, a chest of drawers, a washstand, and a hook on the wall for hanging clothes. It was, as advertised, plain but decent. She got to work immediately. In those first weeks, she and Trask moved around each other with the careful politeness of people who are not yet sure what they are to each other. He was up before dawn every morning, in the kitchen briefly for coffee and biscuits, then out to the land until the light changed. He came in for supper at the same time every evening, ate with an efficiency that was not rudeness, but simply the manner of a man who had been feeding himself alone for a long time. He said thank you every single time she put a plate in front of him, which struck Ruby as significant because she had lived with people who never bothered. He had 2 full-time hands, young men named Buster and Cy, who ate their meals in the bunkhouse and occasionally appeared at the kitchen door for extra coffee. He had a 3rd man who came in from town to help during busy periods, a Mexican man named Felipe who was older than the others and laughed easily and called Ruby Señorita, with a genuine respect that made her feel, unexpectedly, like a person of consequence. Within a month, Ruby had the house running in a way it had clearly not run in some time. She had identified where the leaks in the kitchen roof were and gotten Buster to patch them after she pointed out, with mathematical clarity, how much flour they were losing to damp. She had reorganized the pantry, started a kitchen garden in the strip of good soil along the south wall of the house, planted tomatoes and squash, and 3 rows of corn, negotiated a deal with the Callaway store in town, whereby she exchanged mended clothes for goods at a discount that saved Trask actual money on household expenses. She told him about the money she saved him one evening over supper, laying out the figures she had kept carefully in a small notebook. She expected nothing from this, except perhaps acknowledgement of competent management. Trask looked at the notebook. He looked at the figures. He was quiet for a moment in the way that was becoming familiar to her, the silence of a man who thinks before he speaks rather than speaking in order to think. "That's impressive," he said. Then he looked up from the notebook. "I'd like to raise your pay to $14 a month." Ruby blinked. "I wasn't asking for a raise." "I know you weren't." He handed the notebook back. "But the work is worth more than I offered. I don't like to underpay." She felt something shift in her chest, the way the ground shifts in spring when the frost begins to give. She had been paid exactly what was promised, and no more by every employer she had ever had, and it was the most natural thing in the world to expect. She had never had anyone look at her work and voluntarily decide it deserved more. "Thank you," she said, and was careful to say it without trembling. She watched him after that with a different kind of attention. Not the suspicious inventory she had kept on Gerald Alcott's promises in his letters, reading between every line for hidden motive. This was something more like the way you study a landscape you have begun to live in, learning its contours not to judge them, but to understand them. Trask was a man who said very little but what he said he meant. If he told Buster the north fence would be fixed by Thursday, it was fixed by Thursday. If he told Ruby he would be late for supper because of a cattle count, he was late, and never failed to mention it beforehand so she did not wonder. He had a particular quality that she struggled to name at first, and then one evening she found the word for it. He was reliable. Not reliable the way a good clock is reliable, mechanical and impersonal. Reliable the way a deep well is reliable, something that goes down to something true. The trouble started in early July when Cole Prescott came to call. Cole Prescott was handsome in the manner of a man who has been told so often that he is handsome that it has become a kind of operating assumption. He had a wide, practiced smile and a way of arriving on his horse as though he expected someone to be watching from the window. He was the largest landowner in the valley after the Beaumont brothers, and he knew it the way some men know their height, as a fact that preceded them into every room. He arrived at the kitchen door on a Tuesday afternoon when Trask was out with the herd, and Ruby was up to her elbows in bread dough. "Miss Harper," he said, leaning against the doorframe and angling his hat in a way that he had clearly practiced. "I've been hearing about you from Mrs. Dolan, said you were a capable woman. I can see she was right." "Mr. Prescott," Ruby said, not stopping her kneading, "can I help you with something?" "I'm hoping I can help you," he said. "I hear you're in a difficult situation. Came out here under false pretenses. Alcott let you down." His voice had a rehearsed sympathy. "I'd like to offer you a better arrangement." "I have a position," Ruby said, "working for Trask." Prescott said the name the way you say a word you find slightly boring. "I can offer you $20 a month and a room in the main house, and," he paused significantly, "other possibilities down the line if you follow my meaning." Ruby looked up from the bread dough then. She had flour on her hands and on the front of her apron, and she met Cole Prescott's eyes with a directness that made him blink. "I follow your meaning," she said, "and the answer is no. You haven't thought about it." "I have, in fact, thought about it. I've seen the kind of arrangement you're describing and the kind of promises attached to it. I prefer the arrangement I have." Prescott's smile tightened a fraction. "Trask doesn't have much to offer a woman." "He offered me exactly what he said he would and then gave me more without being asked," Ruby said. "In my experience, that is considerably more than most men offer. Good afternoon, Mr. Prescott." He left, and she went back to her bread dough, and she tried not to examine too carefully why she had felt a hot, private pride when she defended Lionel Trask to a man like Cole Prescott. The summer deepened. July brought heat that pressed down on the land like a hand, and the work was hard, and Ruby found that she did not mind hard work the way she had once feared she might. There was something clarifying about it. She was up at 5 every morning, building the fire in the kitchen stove while the stars were still out, and by the time Trask came in for coffee she had biscuits or cornbread ready, and the kitchen was warm against the early chill. She began to notice small things about him. He had a habit of pausing in the kitchen doorway in the mornings, just for a moment before he came in, as if he was deciding something or preparing for something. She wondered if it was her, if her presence was an adjustment he was still making, and then she decided it was simply the manner of a man who moved through the world with intention rather than momentum. He had a shelf of books in the main room, more books than she had expected, a battered Bible, a worn copy of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, several agricultural texts, a translation of something in what she thought might be French. She asked him about the French one evening, emboldened by 3 months of daily proximity. "I had a teacher in the war," he said. He was sitting in the armchair by the window, mending a length of rope in the unhurried way he did most things. "A French officer. He was attached to our unit for a period. He thought everyone should read French." Ruby registered this. He had been in the war. She did not know which war, but 1882 was only 17 years after Appomattox, and men of his age had often been in it. She did not ask which side because she was not sure she wanted to know, and because the war was a wound on the land that had still not healed and she had learned to move around it carefully. "Did you learn it?" she asked. "Some of it." A pause. "Enough to get through the book." She smiled before she could stop herself. The smile surprised him. She could see it in the way his hands stilled briefly on the rope, but then he went back to his work and neither of them said anything more about it. She started a small library of her own, borrowing books from Mrs. Dolan when she went into town on Saturdays, bringing them back to read in her room on Sunday mornings. He noticed. She knew he noticed because one Tuesday she came in from the kitchen garden to find a book on her windowsill, a copy of Jane Austen's Persuasion, the cover well worn. There was no note. She asked him about it at supper. "It's a good book," he said. "You'd like it." "How do you know what I'd like?" He looked at her across the table, and she had the peculiar sensation of being seen very clearly by someone who was not trying to see her. "You're careful with things," he said. "You pay attention to what's underneath. That book is about what's underneath." She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the narrow iron bed with the window open to the night sounds of the valley and tried to understand the feeling in her chest, which was somewhere between alarm and something she could not yet name. It was the secrets she began to discover next that complicated everything. She had not been snooping. She wanted that understood, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. She had been cleaning the storeroom, which had fallen into a chaotic state under the previous housekeeper, and had found, behind a crate of winter beans, a tin box. She would have set it aside entirely, except the lid was loose and a paper had slipped out, and the word she saw on that paper before she deliberately looked away was foreclosure. She put the box back. She said nothing, but she began to look at the ranch with different eyes, the careful inventory eyes she had developed in years of managing household budgets with not quite enough to work with. She began to count and calculate. The cattle operation was solid, 40 head of good breeding stock plus the beef cattle, and the land was productive. But there was a note on the property, she was fairly certain, a loan from the Callaway Valley Bank that she had overheard referenced obliquely in a conversation between Trask and a man who had ridden out from town one morning in August. The drought that had hit the valley in '81 had hurt the year's cattle sales. Not devastatingly, but enough. And the bank in Callaway had a reputation, which she had heard from Mrs. Dolan and from Felipe, for being unkind to ranchers who were not quite keeping up. She could not raise the subject directly. It was not her business, but she found herself doing two things she had not planned to do. First, she quietly began to extend the kitchen garden, adding winter crops, turnips and onions and dried beans, that would reduce the household food costs significantly. Second, she began, on her own time, on Sunday afternoons, to do fine sewing for the ladies in redemption, the kind of delicate work that commanded real money, alterations and christening gowns and fancy collars, and she saved every cent of what she earned from it in a separate jar behind the flour sacks. She did not know exactly what she was saving for. She only knew that Lionel Trask had given her more than he had promised and asked for nothing, and she was not the kind of woman who received more than she gave. The crisis came in October. She was in the kitchen when she heard the riders come into the yard, and something about the sound of them, the clipped formality of more than one horse approaching in the middle of a working morning, made her wipe her hands on her apron and go to the window. Two men she did not recognize, dressed in the dark suits that said bank or law, and behind them, riding his big bay horse with the ease of someone who owned the ground he rode over, Cole Prescott. Trask came in from the barn. She could see him from the window, crossing the yard with that unhurried, deliberate stride. She watched him listen to what the two suited men were saying, and even from a distance she could see the moment it hit him, not a flinch exactly, nothing so dramatic, but a stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness. This one had the quality of a man absorbing something that was going to cost him. She understood it then entirely. The foreclosure document in the tin box. The bank. The drought-reduced cattle sales of the previous year. They were calling the note. Prescott was smiling, but not at Trask. He was smiling at the yard, at the house, at the land, the way a man smiles at something he expects shortly to own. Ruby went to the tin box in the storeroom. She counted everything in the jar behind the flour sacks. Then she put on her good jacket and walked out into the yard. "Mr. Trask," she said, and her voice was steady as the ground. "Might I have a word?" He looked at her. The two bank men looked at her. Prescott looked at her with the particular kind of attention he always gave her, assessing and possessive, as though she were another piece of property being discussed. "In a moment, Miss Harper," Trask said. "I think the moment should be now," she said, and something in her voice, some quality of absolute resolution, made him excuse himself from the bank men and follow her a few steps away. "What are they here for?" she asked quietly. His jaw tightened. Something I can manage. How much? A pause that told her everything. He was not going to tell her, not because he was dishonest, but because he was a man who had learned to carry his troubles alone. Lionel, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and they both felt it land between them like something dropped from a height. How much? He met her eyes. $240, he said, by the end of the month. She reached into the pocket of her jacket and drew out a small envelope. I have 87, she said. From sewing on Sundays. It's not enough by itself, but there's more to be done. He stared at the envelope. Then he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, an expression she could not entirely read because she had not yet learned all the languages of a face like his, but she recognized the core of it. He was undone slightly, not in a way he would show to anyone else, just slightly, just barely in the space of a private second. That's your money, he said. It's a loan, she said, to be paid back at no interest. And you are going to tell those men you need 30 days to arrange the full amount, and then we are going to arrange it. Ruby. Her name in his voice was something new, something unhurried and careful, the way he handled everything that mattered to him. Why? She looked at him and thought about all the things she could say, the practical answers, the sensible answers, the ones that did not expose anything she was not sure she was ready to expose. She thought about the firewood for the widow in January. She thought about the book left on her windowsill without a note. She thought about $14 a month when 12 had been promised. Because you've never broken a single promise you made, she said. Not even the small ones. Not even the ones nobody was watching, and that is worth more than $87. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to the bank men, and whatever he said to them, they agreed to the 30 days. Prescott rode away last, slower than the others, and he looked at Ruby as he passed. The look was not kind. He was a man who was used to getting what he wanted, and she had now twice placed herself between him and something he wanted, and she could see the dark arithmetic in his eyes as he considered this. She filed that away, because a woman who had managed her own survival since she was 16 years old learned to track potential dangers the way a good rancher tracks weather. In the 3 weeks that followed, she sewed herself nearly blind on Sunday afternoons, took in extra work from the hotel in Redemption, which needed tablecloths hemmed and curtains mended, and consulted with Felipe, who turned out to have a nephew in San Antonio with access to buyers for quality breeding cattle. Trask sold 4 of his best breeding bulls, which hurt him. She could see it in the careful way he watched them loaded into the buyer's wagon, but he did it without complaint and without drama, because that was the kind of man he was. They raised $260 in 22 days. The bank was paid. The note was cleared. That evening after supper, when Buster and Cy had gone to the bunkhouse and Felipe had ridden back to town, Trask poured 2 glasses of the whiskey he kept on the top shelf, a good whiskey, the kind he opened only rarely, and set one in front of Ruby at the kitchen table. She looked at it. I don't usually, she said. Neither do I, he said. Usually. She picked up the glass. He picked up his. They looked at each other across the table, and the lamp was burning between them, and the October night was pressing close against the windows, and in the quality of that silence was everything that had been building between them since May. I want to say something, he said. All right. I have been alone a long time. He said it plainly, without self-pity, just as information, the way he said everything. I came to Texas in 1878, and I built this place from nothing, and I got used to it, the alone. Got so I thought it was just the shape of things. Ruby held her whiskey glass and listened with her whole body. You came here in May, and in 5 months this house has become a place I want to come back to, he said. That's not the house. The house is the same. The silence that followed was long and careful and full. I don't know what I'm offering, he said. I want to be honest about that. I know how to work land and keep cattle and fix things that break. I don't always know how to say what I mean. You're saying it right now, Ruby said. He looked at her. The lamp made shadows and warmth across his face. "I am trying to." She put her whiskey glass down. She thought about Gerald Alcott's letter, the word inconvenience, the cold arithmetic of his affection. She thought about Cole Prescott's practiced smile. She thought about this man who drove firewood to a widow in January when no one was watching. "I came to Texas to build something," she said. "I have been building it in other people's houses my whole life, and I am tired of that. I would like to build something that is also mine." "This could be yours," he said, "if you wanted." "Is that a promise?" she asked, and there was a warmth in the question that she could not keep out, did not try to keep out. "Yes," he said, "it is." She believed him. That was the thing, the extraordinary thing, that she believed him without question or qualification or the anxious second-guessing that had always attended her assessment of what men told her. She believed him because every small thing he had ever said to her had turned out to be exactly true, and she had been paying attention from the beginning. He reached across the table and took her hand, which was roughened from work the same way his was, and they stayed like that for a while, talking and not talking, and the whiskey went warm in both glasses, barely touched, while the night covered the valley and the creek made its sounds outside the window. Cole Prescott was not done, as it turned out. The morning after the bank note was cleared, Ruby was in town picking up supplies at the Callaway General Store when she heard two women talking near the dry goods, not bothering to lower their voices, in the way of women who have decided they are discussing an abstract situation rather than a specific person who is standing 6 feet away. "She moved into his house under the pretense of being a housekeeper," one of them said, "but you know what that really means." Ruby straightened her spine and continued examining a bolt of plain muslin. "Prescott says she's been there since May," the other said. "A single woman alone with a man, no chaperone, no family. He says Trask should be ashamed of himself. He says she came out here looking for exactly this kind of situation, a man with land." Ruby set down the muslin. She turned and looked at both women directly. They were in their 30s, their faces arranged into the expression of people caught between embarrassment at being overheard and commitment to the position they have already taken. "Good morning," Ruby said pleasantly. "I couldn't help noticing you were discussing me. I'll save you the trouble of speculation. I am the housekeeper at the Trask Ranch, which I have been since May, and the work is honest and the arrangement is decent. And if Mr. Prescott is investing his time and energy into discussing my character, he might consider directing that energy toward his own, which by all accounts could use the attention." She picked up her supplies and went to the counter to pay for them, and she heard the silence she left behind her, which had the quality of two people who had expected to be invisible and suddenly are not. Mrs. Dahlin, who had witnessed this from behind a shelf of canned goods, appeared at Ruby's elbow as she was settling her account. "Well done," Mrs. Dahlin said quietly. "For what it's worth, most people in this town have a more charitable view of the situation than those two ladies. But Prescott has been talking. He's been talking quite a lot, in fact, since the bank didn't get the ranch." Ruby looked at her. "He was behind the timing of the foreclosure call." "That is what some people think," Mrs. Dahlin said carefully. "The bank manager, Vernon Graves, has been doing business with Prescott for a long time, and Prescott has been wanting that creek land since Trask bought it." Ruby considered this information. She paid for her supplies and loaded them into the wagon with a calm she did not entirely feel. The dark past of what had nearly happened settled over her on the drive home. She had not known it was orchestrated. But she recognized the shape of it now, the way a person recognizes a trap by the way it has been laid rather than by what it catches. Prescott had been patient and strategic, had waited for a moment of financial vulnerability, had used the bank as the mechanism. When that had failed, he had moved to the social mechanism, the talk, the reputation damage, the undermining. She told Trask that evening. He listened without interrupting, the way he always did, which was one of the things she was coming to love about him, that he gave your words space to exist without rushing to fill them. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know," she blinked. "You know." "I've known for about a month," he said. Pete Calloway's eldest, Danny, works at the bank. He told me what he could." "Then why didn't you?" She stopped. "What are you going to do?" "I've already done it," Trask said. "I went to the county land registrar in October before the note was cleared, and I filed a claim of harassment of financial process against Prescott and Graves. It takes time in the courts, but it's filed." Ruby looked at him. "You filed legal papers?" "I know a lawyer in San Antonio. He's handled it before." He paused. "I didn't tell you because it was in process and I wasn't sure how it would go, and I didn't want to." He stopped. "Alarm me," she said. "Worry you unnecessarily," he said. "You'd already done enough, more than enough." She thought about this. She thought about the ways in which this man protected the people in his circle without announcing that he was doing it, the quiet, consistent, unannounced way of him. "Lionel," she said, "I would like you to tell me things when they are in process, not just when they are resolved." He met her eyes. "You're right," he said. "I will." "Is that a promise?" she said, because now it was a language between them, the word and what it meant. "Yes," he said, "it is." The legal matter against Prescott and Graves moved slowly, the way legal matters did in the territories, but it moved. By February of 1883, it had reached a point where the county court found enough evidence of coordinated financial manipulation to require both Prescott and Graves to answer formal charges. Graves lost his position at the bank. Prescott did not lose his land, because men with a great deal of land rarely lost it through the courts in 1883, but he was fined a considerable sum, and his reputation in the valley took a lasting wound. He did not come near the Trask ranch again. Christmas came between all of this, and it was the best Christmas Ruby had experienced since she was 8 years old and her mother was still alive. She had spent every Christmas since her mother's death in other people's houses, a guest in the obligatory sense, fed and housed but not truly belonging. She had learned to minimize the day for her own protection, to treat it as ordinary, because the alternative was to feel its absence too acutely. On Christmas morning at the Callaway Fork, she came into the kitchen to start the fire and found that Trask had been up before her, which he sometimes was but rarely, and the fire was already burning and the coffee was already made, and on the kitchen table was a small paper-wrapped package with her name on it, written in his deliberate, careful hand. She stood looking at it for a moment. Then she sat down and opened it. It was a sewing case, the kind she had admired without meaning to let it show in the general store window in October, a leather case with brass fittings that contained a full set of quality needles and thread in a dozen colors and a small silver thimble. She had admired it out loud once to no one in particular, in passing. He had been listening. She pressed the sewing case against her chest and sat for a moment with the feelings that were too large for the small kitchen, the feelings that she had been managing carefully for months, because she was not a woman who allowed herself the extravagance of hope without a very solid foundation. He came in from the barn 20 minutes later, stamping snow from his boots, and stopped when he saw her at the table with the sewing case. "All right?" he asked. "More than all right," she said. She looked up at him. "I have something for you too. It's not nearly as fine." She had made him a set of heavy wool socks, dark blue, double-knitted at the heel and toe for durability, and a scarf in the same wool, because she had noticed in January that the one he wore was unraveling at both ends. She had made them on Sunday afternoons when he was out, which, given his predictability, was easy enough to arrange. He took the socks and the scarf and looked at them with the expression she was coming to know, the one that meant he was feeling something he did not have immediate words for. "These are beautifully made," he said at last. "Good wool is its own reward," she said, which was deflection, and he knew it. "Ruby," he said. She looked at him. "I would like to ask you something," he said, "and I want to ask it properly. Not just in passing, not at the end of a conversation about other things." Her heart, which had been doing something complicated for months, did another of its complicated things. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table, the place where they had shared the whiskey in October, where they had dozens of conversations that were really conversations about something underneath the surface of the words. "I know you came here because you had to," he said. I know Alcott was a mistake that happened to you and not a choice you made. I know this year has been hard and strange and nothing like what you planned." She listened. "I know I'm not a man with a great deal to say," he said. "I know I am sometimes too quiet and I keep things inside when I should share them, and I need to be better about that. I am trying to be better about that." He paused. "I know that what I can offer you is this land and this house and the work that it takes to keep them, and my absolute and complete honesty, and the certainty that I will keep every promise I make you, everyone, including the small ones, especially the small ones, because I believe the small ones are where the truth of a person lives." Ruby's throat had closed. She swallowed carefully. "I would like you to marry me," Lionel Trask said. "Not because you need a situation and I happen to have one. Because you are the most capable and honest and clear-eyed person I have ever known. And this house became a home when you walked into it, and I do not want to imagine it any other way." The wind moved outside. The fire crackled. The snow was coming down again softly through the window glass. "Yes," Ruby said. "My answer is yes. It has been yes for quite some time, if I'm being honest." The wedding was in February, on a day that was cold but bright, the kind of winter day in Texas when the sky is such a hard, clear blue it almost hurts to look at it. They were married by the circuit judge, who came through redemption every third Wednesday, a practical and legal ceremony in the presence of Mrs. Dahlen, who wept happily into her handkerchief, and Buster and Cy, who wore their cleanest shirts, and Felipe, who brought his wife Rosa from San Antonio and presented Ruby with a shawl in deep crimson that Rosa had embroidered herself, which was more beautiful than anything Ruby had ever owned. She wore her best dress, which was a deep green wool she had made herself, fitted at the waist in the style of the year, and she had embroidered small flowers at the collar and cuffs because she could not help herself. Trask wore his good dark coat and a clean white shirt, and when she walked into the room where the judge was waiting, he looked at her with the clear, uncomplicated sincerity that was the most fundamental thing about him, and she felt, with the certainty of something long established, that she had arrived somewhere she was meant to be. The judge read the words. They said what they were supposed to say. When it was done, Trask took her hand in both of his, which was not the ceremony's instruction but his own instinct, and held it for a long, quiet moment. Mrs. Dahlen gave a supper at the boarding house, which became a party that lasted until 10 in the evening, with fiddle music and dancing that spilled out onto the porch, and Ruby danced with Felipe and with Buster and with the young deputy sheriff who kept stepping on her feet with anxious apology, and finally with Trask, who turned out to be a better dancer than anyone had predicted. "Where did you learn to dance?" she murmured against his shoulder. "My mother," he said. "She thought it was important." She leaned back to look at him. "Tell me about your mother." And he did, which was a beginning because there were still things he held close and would need time to open, and she was in no hurry. She had all the time in the world now. They both did. The spring of 1883 was a good spring. The rains came in the right measure at the right time, and the grass grew up thick across the valley, and Trask's cattle were fat and healthy, and the kitchen garden Ruby planted was the largest yet, expanding along both the south and east walls of the house, full of vegetables and 3 varieties of squash, and a row of sunflowers that she had planted simply because she wanted to. Because she was finally in a place where planting things for pleasure was something she could afford to do. She found, to her simultaneous joy and terror, in April, that she was going to have a child. She calculated dates with the careful precision she applied to everything, consulted Mrs. Dahlen, who had midwifed half the babies in the valley, and determined that the baby would arrive in October. She told Trask on a Tuesday evening, over supper, as directly as she did everything. He was very still for a moment. Then he got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took her face in his hands and looked at her with something in his expression that was so unguarded and so complete that she had to close her eyes for a moment because she could not hold all of it with them open. "Are you happy?" he asked, against her hair. Yes, she said. Are you? More than I know how to say, he said. I'll have to find words for it. You will, she said. You're getting better at that. He laughed, which was something she had been cultivating in him all winter, a slow and rewarding cultivation, the finding of the laughter that lived underneath all that careful quiet. When Lionel Trask laughed, it came from somewhere genuine, and it was worth the work of finding it. He worked harder that spring than she had ever seen him work, expanding the cattle operation, negotiating a partnership with Felipe's nephew that brought a reliable buyer for their best beef in San Antonio. He hired 2 additional hands, made the bunkhouse more livable, built a new storage room behind the kitchen that had proper shelving and a ventilated pantry the way Ruby had described as ideal. He did not say he was building it because there was a child coming. He just built it. She noticed everything. She noticed everything. In June, she convinced him to take 2 days away from the ranch, the first 2 consecutive days off she had observed him take since she had known him. They drove the wagon to San Antonio to meet with Felipe's nephew about the cattle contract, which was the practical reason. And while they were there, they went to a proper restaurant for supper, and then to a theater performance, an amateur production of a Shakespeare play that was more enthusiastic than skilled but completely engaging. And Ruby laughed so genuinely at certain of the performances that Trask watched her laugh more than he watched the stage. On the way home the next day, he said, "We should do that again. Go to San Antonio, take time," he said, "do things that aren't necessary, that are just—" He paused, searching for the word. "Good," she smiled at the road ahead. "Yes. We absolutely should. I'll put it in the plan," he said. "Is that a promise?" He looked at her sidelong, the warmth in it deliberate and private. "Yes," he said. "It is." Summer was rich and full, and she learned things about being a wife that she had not known about from being a housekeeper, which was mostly that the line between the two was not where she had imagined it to be. The love was not separate from the work. It lived inside the work, in the way he brought her a cup of coffee before she asked for one, in the way she kept track of which pieces of fence he had identified as needing attention, and occasionally noted quietly to Buster or Cy that such and such a section might want looking at. In the shared understanding of how a life is constructed day by day from 100 small decisions, most of them mundane, some of them crucial, and in the willingness to make those decisions together. He talked more than he had. Slowly, incrementally, the words came easier. She thought it was because she had created a space in which words were safe, in which saying something imperfectly was not met with impatience or judgment. She had grown up in a world where imperfect words cost you something. She made sure that in her world, in their world, they didn't. He told her about his childhood in the border country of Missouri, a family with 6 children, and not much land, and a father who worked himself to the edge of what a body could sustain. He told her about the war, carefully and partially, enough to understand that he had seen things that cost him, that some of what she had read as quietness in him was also the scar tissue of witnessed violence, and she held this knowledge gently and did not press further than what he offered. He told her about the years after the war, the drifting, the gradual discovery that what he wanted was land and rootedness, the slow accumulation of the means to achieve it. She told him things in return. About her mother, who had smelled of lavender water and who could make a meal out of almost nothing, and who had sung hymns on Sunday mornings. About her father, who had been gentle and unreliable in equal measure, which meant they had loved each other but had not had enough. About the dress shop and the years of other people's houses and the way she had taught herself to want less than she felt, because wanting too much was the luxury of people with more security than she had. "You can want now," he said. "Whatever you need, whatever matters." She looked at him in the lamplight of their bedroom. "I know," she said. "I am learning to believe it." "Take your time," he said. "We have plenty." October came with a sharp bite in the air and the cottonwoods going gold along the creek, and on the 12th of October, after a labor that Mrs. Dahlin oversaw with competent authority, Ruby brought a son into the world. He was a large, emphatic baby with dark hair like his father and his mother's stubborn jaw. And when Trask first held him, standing in the bedroom doorway with the October light coming gold through the window, the expression on his face was the most completely open thing Ruby had ever seen on a human being. All the careful reserve was simply gone. He held his son and he could not speak at all for a while, and when he finally looked up at her, there were tears on his face which he did not attempt to conceal. "What do you want to call him?" Ruby asked. Her voice was tired and warm. "What do you want?" he asked. She had been thinking about it for months. "James," she said, "for your father, and William for nobody in particular, just because I like it." He looked down at the baby. "James William Trask," he said, as if he was trying the weight of it. "That's right," he said. "That's who you are." James William Trask was a determined baby who grew into a determined small boy with his father's habit of pausing before he did things, assessing them first, and his mother's habit of doing 4 things at once when one was all that was required. He was beloved by Buster and Cy, who taught him things about horses before he could walk properly, and by Felipe, who taught him 3 words of Spanish on each visit that Rosa extended to full sentences with considerable amusement. The years that followed had their difficulties, because every life does, and the West was particularly unsparing about this. There was another drought, not as severe as the one in '81 but long enough to test the careful management that Ruby and Trask had established. There was a bad winter in which 24 cattle were lost. There was a dispute with a neighbor to the north about a water access that went through mediation and cost 3 months of stress and legal fees and ended in their favor, but cost them something nonetheless. There was the year that Buster was thrown by a horse and broke his arm badly, and spent 3 months being nursed back to function in the main house, during which Ruby read to him in the evenings and taught him to play checkers left-handed, and Trask adjusted the work assignments with a patience that cost him significantly in terms of what got done, because Buster was worth the cost, and they both knew it. There was the Sunday afternoon Ruby's old friend Clara Weiss, the only real friend from her St. Louis days, arrived on the stage from Abilene, having written ahead to say she was coming, following a divorce from a man who had been a dark past that Clara was finally free of. Clara stayed 6 weeks and brought laughter to the house in a different key, a bright, relentless energy that did James William considerable delight and gave Ruby something she had not known she was missing, the uncomplicated company of a woman who had known her from before. Clara eventually settled in San Antonio, close enough for occasional visits, far enough to make those visits feel like genuine events. Through all of it, through the droughts and the difficulties and the good years and the celebrations, Ruby watched Lionel Trask keep his promises, not in a deliberate or performed way, just quietly, consistently, as the fundamental expression of who he was. He said he would fix the east fence by Friday. He fixed it by Thursday. He said he would take James William to see the cattle auction in town when the boy was old enough to understand it. When James William was 7 and clearly old enough, Trask drove him into Redemption for the auction and stood beside him while the boy watched the whole proceedings with enormous wide-eyed attention. He told Ruby once, in the darkness of their room after James William had been put to bed, that he had grown up watching his father promise things and not keep them, not from malice, from the kind of overwhelm that came from a man stretched too thin over too little ground. But he had felt, as a child, the particular and specific pain of a small promise broken, the kind that nobody thinks is important, the kind that is easy to forget. "It matters more when it's small," he said. "The large promises, everyone notices. Everyone holds you to those. The small ones are the ones only the person you made them to remembers." She lay beside him and looked at the ceiling and thought about that. "Is that why?" she asked. "Is that why what?" "The widow in January with the firewood." He was quiet for a moment. "Pete Calloway told me once that his wife worried about the winters," he said. "I told him I'd make sure she had wood. He died before that winter, and nobody would have known if I hadn't done it." He paused. "But I would have known." She turned and looked at his profile in the dark. "That is the most important thing anyone has ever told me," she said quietly. He turned his head. "Why?" "Because I grew up in a world where things that nobody saw didn't count," she said. "Where doing right was only worth doing if it was witnessed. And you are the proof that it's not true. That some people just," she searched for the words, "just are who they are whether anyone is looking or not." He reached over and found her hand in the dark. "You're the same," he said. "I learned it differently," she said. "You never had to learn it, you just knew it." He held her hand and didn't argue, because he was not a man who argued when someone was paying him a genuine compliment. He simply held her hand, and the night settled around them, and the land was quiet outside, and James William was sleeping safely in the next room, and the kitchen was clean, and the pantry was full, and the cattle were in the south pasture, and the fence along the creek was exactly where it was supposed to be. James William turned 10 in October of 1893, and it was at his birthday supper, a rare occasion of real celebration with Felipe and Rosa and their youngest daughter Maria, who was 17 and completely taken with James William, in a way that made both sets of parents exchange carefully neutral glances, that Ruby told Trask that James William was going to have a sibling. He registered this with the same internal stillness he had shown the first time, followed by the same complete openness of expression, and then he said to James William across the supper table, "You're going to be a brother." James William considered this information with the family habit of thinking before responding. Then he said, "When?" "Late spring," Ruby said. "Will it be a boy or a girl?" "We'll find out when it arrives," Trask said. "That's how it works." "I'd like a brother," James William said. "But a sister might be interesting." In April of 1894, Ruby delivered a daughter, which was not what James William had requested, but which he greeted, after a brief philosophical adjustment, with a solemn protectiveness that made Trask's chest ache with pride. They named her Clara Ann, the Clara for Ruby's friend, and the Ann for Trask's mother, whose name Ruby had finally learned, 3 years into their marriage, when Trask had finally begun to talk about his family with the fluency of a man who has decided the past is not a threat. Clara Ann was as different from her brother as weather can be. She was quick where he was deliberate, loud where he was quiet, interested in everything at once where he focused on one thing completely. She followed her father around from the age of 2, with a devotion that he received with a helpless and delighted bewilderment, because he had not expected, somehow, the degree to which a small daughter could reduce a steady and contained man to something that laughed easily and made silly faces, and lay on the floor of the main room playing with wooden blocks that James William had outgrown years ago. Ruby watched him with his children and felt the particular fullness of a woman who has built, against considerable odds, the precise life she needed. The Trask Ranch was a thriving operation by 1895. 30 more acres had been added to the original holding, purchased carefully over the years from a neighbor who retired east. The cattle operation had a solid reputation in 2 counties, and the partnership with Felipe's nephew had expanded to include a trail contract that made the San Antonio connection financially significant. Ruby's kitchen garden had evolved into a genuine productive enterprise. The excess produce sold through the general store in Redemption, a small but steady income that she had always kept as her own contribution to the household account, a symbol of the thing she had known from the beginning, that she was a partner in this place, not an employee and not a dependent, but a full and equal architect of what they had made together. Mrs. Dahlin came to supper at the ranch several times a year, an occasion that everyone in the household looked forward to. She was older now, moving more slowly, the red of her hair gone entirely to silver, but the voice and the laugh were unchanged, and she sat at the kitchen table and ate Ruby's cooking with the satisfaction of a woman who had made a good bet and watched it pay. "I told her," she reminded everyone periodically, because Mrs. Dahlin was a woman who liked to take appropriate credit. "I told her about the firewood." "You told me everything else too," Ruby said. "The other 5 ranchers." You had to know the context, Mrs. Dollin said, waving her fork. The contrast. How else would you have known what to look for? I knew when I rode out there and found him fixing a fence, Ruby said. In the middle of a work morning, in the middle of his own land, nobody watching. Mrs. Dollin pointed her fork at Trask. See, she saw you. Trask looked across the table at Ruby. He had a way of looking at her that had not diminished over the years, that had only become more settled, more certain of itself, more at home. I know, he said. I saw her first. The night before James William left for his first real independent venture, a cattle-buying trip to Abilene for the ranch. He was 19 years old and steady as a good post, and he sat with his parents in the main room after supper while Clara Ann slept in her room and the lamp burned low, and he asked his father something he had been assembling the courage for. How do you know, he said, if you can trust someone, before you have enough experience of them to know for certain? Trask looked at his son for a long moment. Then he glanced at Ruby. You watch the small things, he said. The things that don't matter to anyone but the person they were promised to. The things a person could forget about or decide weren't worth keeping and no one would know. The small promises are where you find out who someone really is. James William listened to this very carefully. Is that how you knew about Mama? He asked. Your mother is the one who watched me, Trask said. She gave me more credit than I deserved for knowing it first. You knew you could trust him, James William asked Ruby. Before I came looking, Ruby said. From a story about firewood in January. About a widow and a promise and nobody watching. She looked at her husband. I decided right then what kind of man you were. I just had to come and see if I was right. Were you? James William asked. Ruby smiled. I was more right than I even knew how to look for. James William left for Abilene in the morning with 3 of the hands and 2 letters of introduction, and a horse that was the best in Trask's string. He came back 3 weeks later having purchased 14 cattle at a price that made Trask look at the receipt twice, and then look at his son with the expression of a man who has been pleasantly surprised. Where did you learn to negotiate like that? Trask asked. From you, James William said. And from Mama, you both just do it differently. How differently? Ruby asked from the kitchen doorway. You are direct, he said to her. You tell them exactly what you want and exactly why it's fair, and they can't find a foothold to argue from. Papa is quiet until they start to feel uncertain about the silence, and then he makes his offer. He paused. I used both. Ruby looked at Trask. Trask looked at Ruby. That's our son, she said. That is certainly our son, he agreed. Clara Ann, who had been 5 during the Abilene trip, and thus not fully tracking the commercial dimensions of it, emerged from somewhere behind Ruby's skirts to demand that James William produce the present he had promised her, which he did from his coat pocket, a small carved horse that he had found at a market stall and recognized immediately as something his sister would treasure. You promised, Clara Ann said, examining the carved horse with intense satisfaction. I know, James William said. Good, Clara Ann said, with the absolute certainty of a 5-year-old who expects promises to be kept. Because promises count. Ruby crouched down beside her daughter and wrapped an arm around the small, warm body. She looked up at Trask, who was watching his children with that unguarded expression she had come to think of as the truest version of him, the one underneath all the quiet competence, the one that loved without reservation. Yes, Ruby said. They do. Redemption, Texas in 1897 was not the same town it had been in 1882. The railroad had come through 4 years earlier, which brought more people and more commerce and 2 new streets and a proper school that Clara Ann attended with enormous enthusiasm, and a gift for arithmetic that made her teacher write Ruby a letter about her prospects. The Callaway General Store had expanded, and there were now 2 additional shops and a new hotel and a doctor who had come from Dallas and intended to stay. Mrs. Dollin's boarding house was sold in 1897 to a young couple from the East because Mrs. Dollin's joints had finally staged a successful rebellion against the work, and her niece in Denver had a spare room and an insistent nature. The farewell supper was at the Trask Ranch, which was large enough now, with a dining room that Ruby had added to the south side of the house when they had the money and the need to hold a proper gathering. Mrs. Dolan embraced Ruby at the end of the evening with the warmth of a woman saying goodbye to something she is genuinely proud of. "You turned out exactly as I expected," she said. "Better, even." "I had good information," Ruby said, and meant every word. After Mrs. Dolan's wagon disappeared down the road toward Redemption, Ruby stood in the yard for a while, looking at the land in the early dark. The cottonwoods along the creek were silver in the rising moon. The cattle were settled in the south pasture. The barn was solid and well lit. The house behind her was warm and full. Trask came and stood beside her. He did not say anything for a while, which was his way, giving her the quiet she was using. "Do you ever think about St. Louis?" he asked finally. She considered it genuinely. "Sometimes," she said, "not with regret, just the distance of it." "If you could go back," he said, "not to change anything, just to tell the woman you were then something, what would you say?" She looked at the stars, which were coming out over the flat, dark horizon with the brilliance that the cities never showed you. She thought about the woman in a blue calico dress, reading a letter that said inconvenience, and trying to decide how much of herself remained intact. "I would tell her," Ruby said slowly, "that the worst thing that happened to her was going to set her on the exact road that led to where she needed to be, and that the man she was riding out to meet was not the one who would matter. That one was fixing a fence when she arrived, in the middle of his own land when nobody was watching." She paused. "And I would tell her not to be afraid of how much she was going to love him, because he was going to be worth every bit of it and more." Trask was quiet beside her. She felt him reach for her hand in the dark, the familiar warmth and steadiness of his hand, the hand that had kept every promise it had ever made. "Ruby," he said. "Lionel," she said. He put his arm around her and pulled her close, and she leaned against his side and looked at the stars. And they stood there in the yard of the ranch they had built together, in the life they had built together. While inside the house James William was reading by the lamp, and Clara Ann was already deep asleep with the carved horse on her pillow, and the creek made its quiet sound through the cottonwoods, and the night was full of everything that was solid and good and real. He bent his head down and pressed his lips to her hair, and she felt it in her chest, the way she always felt it, that particular and specific warmth of being known by someone who chose to go on knowing you, day after day, through the ordinary and the extraordinary, through the hard winters and the good springs and the years that were simply years, full of small moments and small promises and the quiet daily accumulation of everything that was worth building a life for. "I love you," he said. Against her hair, quiet as everything else he said that was true. "I know," she said. "I love you too, I have for a very long time." "I know," he said. "I knew before you said it." "How?" "The $87, he said. "In the envelope. That's when I knew." She laughed, and the sound of it went out into the warm night air of Texas, and the stars were bright over the Callaway Fork, and the fence lines were straight and the promises were kept. Everyone, including the small ones, especially the small ones, because that was where the truth of a person lived. And the truth of Lionel Trask, and the truth of Ruby Harper, and the truth of the life they had built together in Redemption, Texas, was as solid and as honest and as quietly remarkable as the man who had first caught her attention, not with a grand speech or a lavish offer, but with a cord of firewood delivered on a cold January morning to a widow's cabin, with no audience and no accounting, just because he had said he would. Some years later, when Clara Ann was grown and asking her mother the kind of questions that daughters ask, the ones about how you know, how you really know, Ruby told her the story of the firewood. Clara Ann listened the way her father listened, with her whole attention, and at the end she sat for a moment with the thinking expression that was entirely her own. "So the small promises are the important ones," she said. "The small promises," Ruby said, "are the ones that show you who someone is when it doesn't cost them anything to be someone else, when they could easily forget or quietly excuse themselves and no one would hold it against them." She paused. "That's the only true test. Everything else is performance." Clara Ann thought about this carefully, How do I find someone like that? Ruby smiled at her daughter, this person who was simultaneously nothing like her and entirely like her, who had her father's patience and her mother's directness and some quality entirely her own that made her magnetic in a room. Pay attention to the small things, Ruby said. Not the speeches, not the grand gestures, the small things, the promises that nobody witnessed, the follow-through that nobody asked about. That's where the truth is. Clara Ann nodded slowly. That's how you knew about Papa. That's how I knew, Ruby said. Before I even met him, before I rode out there to find him. She looked out the window toward the south pasture, where Trask was visible at a distance, working the land with the same unhurried, deliberate care he had brought to everything for 30 years. I knew from a story someone told me, about a man who had made a promise when nobody was watching and kept it in the cold of January with no credit and no audience. And I thought, that is a man I want to know. And then you loved him, Clara Ann said. And then I loved him, Ruby agreed. Rather urgently and rather permanently as it turned out. Clara Ann looked out at her father. He's a good man. He is the best man I have ever known, Ruby said, with the complete and uncomplicated certainty of a woman who had reason to say so, and had never once had cause to doubt it. The sun went long and gold across the Texas land, the way it did in late afternoon in the good seasons, painting the grass and the fence lines and the face of the house in shades that a painter would struggle to believe. Trask came in from the south pasture with the slow walk of a man at the end of a productive day, and he saw, through the kitchen window, Ruby and Clara Ann at the table, and he stopped for a moment in the yard, the way he had always paused in the doorway, taking the measure of something before entering it. But this time Ruby saw him, through the window, and she raised her hand in the small gesture that was entirely their own, the private signal of acknowledgement that had developed over years without either of them deciding on it, that simply existed between them the way the most real things exist, without being established or declared. He raised his hand back. And then he came inside, into the warmth and the light and the life that was his, that was theirs, built day by day from honest work and honest words and every promise kept, no matter how small, no matter who was watching. The creek ran silver through the cottonwoods. The stars came out over Texas. The Callaway Fork was quiet and good and full of everything that mattered. And Lionel Trask and Ruby Harper, who had found each other by the grace of small things noticed and kept, sat down to supper with their daughter and the world they had made together, and were entirely, completely, unambiguously home.